The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided that the Nobel Peace Prize for 2012 is to be awarded to the European Union.
On December 10th, 2012, in a unanimous decision by the Norwegian Nobel Committee, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the European Union for its contribution to the advancement of peace and reconciliation, democracy and human rights in Europe. 10 years on, war has returned to European soil. How did we get here? There's been no shortage of crossroads over the past decade. Economic crises, harsh austerity measures, social unrest, and a global pandemic that claimed the lives of more than 2 million people across Europe. Now the war in Ukraine is offering the Union its latest challenge and jolting the foundations of the global multilateral system. In a series of exclusive interviews, European leaders deliver their view on the most serious mistakes of the past, as well as the biggest challenges for the future. All in an attempt to answer one question: where do we go from here? You have previously described the Nobel Peace Prize and that ceremony as one of the highlights of your political career. What do you remember of the ceremony and of the importance of that moment for the European Union?
Mm-hmm. I delivered a speech, the best speech in my life. I tried to raise to the occasion, and I saw all of a sudden in the room that President Hollande, the French president, took the hands of the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel. They stood up, and it was really an emotional moment, because at that moment it was Merkel and Hollande, of course, but it was also Giscard and Schmidt. It was also Mitterrand and Kohl who were there in the room.
You quoted Spinoza during your speech. You said that peace is not merely the absence of war, is a state of mind, a disposition for benevolence, confidence, justice. There can only be true peace if people trust their political system and believe that their basic rights are respected. Do you feel as though people in Europe at that time felt that way about the European Union?
It's not just about the absence of war. And in the European Union, we are proud to have a community of values. It's about democracy, about freedom, about rule of law, about equality of rights between men and women. Some of these issues are now taken for granted, but unfortunately, they were not always, and they are not in other parts of the world. So that's why I believe, yes, while there are challenges and issues, and certainly the European Union is not perfect, but I believe that without arrogance, we can be proud of the community of values we have been able to establish in Europe.
At that time, Europe was going through some very difficult times. There was a crisis of the euro. There were austerity measures in place. There were protests in the streets of many European capitals, with many people saying that politicians in Brussels had forgotten what they felt.
You remember, at that time, many analysts were predicting the collapse of the euro, Greece leaving the euro. It did not happen. On the contrary, now we have more countries joining the euro. Now we are going to welcome a new member in the euro. And so that has shown the great resilience of the European Union. But once again, I want to be honest in my answer. The European Union is not perfect, and there are issues, as we have in all democracies. And if one country, nation state with a democracy, there is a problem, of course, you can imagine that in 27 countries, multi-level points of decision, those problems still exist. So that's the way it is. But at the end of the day, in politics, it's always about the counterfactual. Would it be better, the alternative? I'm sure not. I'm sure it will be much worse to have those 27 countries competing all the time or trying to fight for supremacy. Today, there is a spirit of compromise, a spirit of shared sovereignty that I believe is more and more important for the world today.
There was a strong determination to find common ground, to find the right compromise and to overcome the crisis, to reassure the financial markets. to save Greece, Spain, Portugal, and at a certain moment Italy was even under threat. So there's this strong political will present in the room, in the hearts and the minds of the leaders. Without political will, you cannot overcome any problem. You need that strong determination. But it took time, 2.5 years. But for history, only the result remains. Only the result counts. I think when the history of the European Union will be written in a few decades, they will not mention those long negotiations. They are all forgotten. We saved the euro. We saved the Eurozone. And by saving the Eurozone, we saved the European Union. Because the collapse of the Eurozone would have been the collapse of the European Union.
And do you think that would have also meant the end of peace in this conflict?
Don't forget that the European Union is the biggest project ever in the history of Europe. So when there is what you call the unraveling of the European Union, peace is at risk. Peace is at risk.
Thousands of years with no single day without a war between countries in Europe, and now since more than 7 decades, peace. Why? Because we created a structure where war between members of the European Union is impossible. This is a model in itself, perhaps not for other parts of the world, but for Europe it was the best solution.
I want to talk to you about the place we are right now, because Europe was created from the ashes of World War II, and we are standing right now at the site of the last strike that London, central London, suffered during World War II. Right here, a V-2 rocket fell, killing 9 people, destroying a church, destroying a tavern. Do you feel as though people forget just how dark Europe's past was?
Sometimes people forget, yes, and that's why I very often say, only those who cannot remember the past can have such a negative opinion of the Europe of the present. It's true, in Europe we are fighting very serious problems, but at least in the European Union, among its members, there was never a war since the creation of the European Community in the 50s. And today we can say that war is unthinkable among the European countries like France and Germany that were fighting for so many centuries, and other countries in Europe. So from that point of view, the European Community, the European Union, as a project for peace was a success. Having said that, we should avoid all forms of complacency, because in other parts of Europe, for instance in Ukraine, which is not a member of the European Union, but very close to us, there is now a terrible war, an aggression launched by Russia against Ukraine, and we had the wars in the Balkans.
Putin has a goal to destroy the European Union. Exactly the goal of Putin is transnational, cross-border, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural cooperation of different nations is the opposite of what the Russians want, or Putin wants.
Basically, some of the critics said that while, yes, the European project was created to forge peace, it had since shunned peace and reconciliation, democracy and human rights. What do you say to those critics?
There is no alternative. I think Europe as bringing together countries, I speak to my British colleagues all the time and I miss them, but I really think that for the countries that are members of the European Union today, after emerging from such a difficult pandemic and now showing such unity with regards to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now how we're going to find common solutions on energy, on migration, on investment in green and digital, I think if it weren't for Europe, we would be all going our way. The instinct is always to do that, to close borders, to look inwards. But if one thing has shown us and taught us is that being together is so much stronger. So I would answer those critics. I would never ignore them. I think that that's the mistake we might have made, is thinking that the project can live alone, but we need to fight for it, we need to defend it, and I think most importantly, we need to explain it.
During all those crises, we showed much more unity, with the exception of Brexit, much more unity than most people were envisaging and hoping for. And we surprised ourselves and we surprised the world.
Europe still remains the best thing that can happen to a country joining the European Union, but also being a candidate country. The accession process is a transformative process for a country in terms of giving access to young people, to programs, to research, to education, to free movement, to roaming. Small milestones, but huge for individual countries. So I would think that yes, the challenges are there. Migration remains a challenge. We have legislative tools for it. At the end of the day, it's a question of political will. But it is a reality that for millions and millions of people around the world, coming to Europe represents a better life. Coming to Europe represents work. Coming to Europe also represents protection. And that's something we should never forget.
Why do you think some people still don't feel as though they're better off within the EU?
I mean, first of all, we are democracies. There are many different opinions, and that's great. It's great that we have different opinions, and by the way, that they have the opportunity to express those opinions. But the reality is that on a huge majority, according to all public opinion indications, support the European Union. They are skeptical about many things, as they are about their own governments. If you ask some of those people, are they happy with the government of their country? Are they happy with the parliament? Probably they will be even more negative about their own governments than about the European Union. This does not mean that the European Union cannot and should not do more to become closer to its citizens. It's really a challenge.
The European Union as a peace project is guaranteeing the peace among the members of the European Union. It's not a coincidence that the two wars we had on the European continent in the last 30, 40 years were outside the European Union. The Balkan wars, and of course this tragedy in Ukraine. It was a war launched not by a European country, it was a war launched by Russia against Ukraine, now a candidate member of the European Union, by the way. So it's on the European soil, but there's a big difference.
When he started the invasion of Crimea in 2014, I spoke with Vladimir Putin. I asked him, what's going on? And he said, oh, it's not an invasion. These are some people around Crimea. They are Russians, they have cousins, they have friends, they have family. They are going there. And he said, because if it was the Russian army, I can guarantee you that we could take Kiev in less than 2 weeks. When now it happens in the 2022, the invasion of Ukraine, for me it was not a complete surprise, because I think it was already in his mind some kind of action against Ukraine. But frankly, I was not supposing this kind of full invasion that he has launched. Because I think it is so irrational, also from his point of view, from the point of view of Russian interest. I believe it's of course, first of all, a tragedy for Ukraine, but it's also a tragedy for Russia. So I did not expect...
Is it a tragedy for Europe as well?
As well.
In terms of where he leaves the EU?
Of course it is. We have now a war in Europe, so it's very bad for Europe. But it's bad for the world in general. Because if this principle now of that a country, in this case the biggest country in the world, in geographic terms, can invade and take parts of the territory of a smaller country, if this principle is now accepted, in that case, it will be the biggest threat to world peace.
How did we get here? How do we go from a Nobel Peace Prize to war returning to European soil?
I would ask that to Vladimir Putin and ask why on the 24th of February he decided that his tanks should roll into an independent and territorially sovereign democratic country. I would also give credit to the fact that notwithstanding his thoughts that he could take over such a strong, high-spirited, courageous country in a few days, that today they are still fighting with the same spirit and courage, which is something I saw with my very own eyes when I went on the 1st of April when Kiev was still surrounded. We see that spirit that is fought for Europe, and I think it is that spirit that has to keep us going and continue to push for the Russian Federation to pull out of Ukraine. Until that happens, then we are going to continue without any choice but to respond proportionately to the threat that has been placed at our feet, at our doorstep, if not within our continent, by one man.
Do you feel Europe as a whole has been naive with regards to Russia's position and with regards to other crises as well?
I respect Russia as a country. I do not agree with the current regime, the current situation there. But it's a great country, Russia, a great civilization, by the way, part of the European civilizations. And I think we have done our best to try to establish some kind of relationship. But unfortunately, for instance, he did not accept that Ukraine wanted to be member. In fact, not at that time it was not members of the European Union, but associated, have an association with the European Union. The source of the problem is the fact that Russia, or the leadership of Russia, did not accept that one country that is independent and sovereign, full member of the United Nations, has the right to choose its own future. That's the problem. It was not created by us. I think we were in good faith working with Ukraine and with Russia, but at the end of the day, Russia has shown, or this leadership of Russia has shown that they did not deserve the confidence that we have shown.
Where will Europe be in 10 years' time, in your opinion? Where do you think Europe is heading?
Well, I think Europe is now losing some of its innocence, if you agree with that expression. I mean, because it's true that European Union, for a long time, was more thinking about the markets, economic integration, and not sufficiently about power. And at the end of the day, we need power to defend our values. We are living in a rough, tough neighborhood. So, and from that point of view, there has been a development.
Are you talking about military power?
Including military power, yes. The European, the development of European pillar in the transatlantic alliance, and in fact now the European Union is taking some initiatives in terms of defense that it was not taken before, because the conditions were not mature. The first duty of any political entity is to be able to defend its very existence. And so I think that's why now today we speak very often in Europe about strategic autonomy, European sovereignty, and I think it makes sense. I fully support that. To protect our values, including the values of peace, we need to be ready politically and also in military terms. That there is the old saying in Latin, si vis pacem para bellum. It means if you want peace, prepare for your war.
We were faced with a fundamental question on the 24th of February. Do we respect the principle of territorial integrity? Do we respect the principle of sovereignty? Do we respect the principle of you being able to live in freedom, with peace, justice, not with a constant fear of an illegal, brutal invasion that could happen from one day to another? In 2008, we looked away. In 2014, we looked away. We couldn't do that in 2022. We did not do that, and I think that's what we were asked to do. Will you stand on the correct side of history or not? Because if we didn't, who would be next?
We should go. No.
Just, I think, 2 months after the Russian invasion. And my daughter-in-law, and they live very close to my home, called me and said, your grandson, I'm his godfather also, by the way, your grandson is traumatized, he cannot sleep, he was listening to the news, also the news on television for kids and so on, and there was this rumor about the possibility of a nuclear war. And I went, of course, directly to their home, I forgot what I told him. But the only thing was, believe me, this will not happen. And he believed his old grandfather. I don't took away, I think, all his anxieties and fears, but at least he had that moment of reassurance. If he is telling this, it could be true, or it will be right. But for me, the big lesson was, if this kid, 10 years old, is so fearful, then many others are sharing the same kind of anxiety. And we have a role to play, and not only to reassure people, but to organize society, to organize Europe, to organize the world in such a way that there is no reason to fear anymore.
Meanwhile, in Ukraine, fear remains a constant. Even in places where terror gave way, albeit temporarily, to happiness and relief. Like here in Kherson, known as the hero city for the resistance its residents showed in the face of Russian occupation.
Но это не один день было, это много дней было. Мы и шли, вся толпа, люди и шли от, будем говорить, Ушакова сначала и спускались дальше до набережной. Там, всей толпой. Потом было такое, когда проезжала ихняя русская машина, российская, бронетоэта, и парень заскочил с флагом на нее. Начали стрельбу. Бронетранспортер там был, но я толком не знаю, как они это. Запрыгнул туда с флагом, и он проехал, что там дальше, но потом говорили, что дальше, что его арестовали. А как там дальше, на самом деле, не знаю. У меня душа болела, очень болела душа тогда. Я и плакала тогда. Оно было обидно, до такой степени обидно, что так нас, будем говорить, пришли твари, я не знаю, как по-другому их назвать. Но это ж тогда этот же, получается, ихний грузовик, этот КамАЗ. И тогда он сюда пытался проехать, толпа, обратно его отодвигала. Но это тогда еще они еще не стреляли, более мирно это было как-то это. А уже на следующие дни началась стрелянина, дымовые шашки закидывали на нас. И после того мы перестали выходить из-за того, что побоялись за свои жизни.
The occupation of Kherson was to last 8 months, a long time, but not enough to make people here forget what Ukraine is fighting for.
Надеюсь, что будет мир. Надеюсь. Прекрасное будущее. Как европейские государства, как и в Европе, мы к этому и стремимся.
European, do you want to be part of the European Union, for example? Is that something that is important for you here?
Конечно, да.